Hello and welcome to another community conversation looking at the impacts of coronavirus on the country and especially Virginia. Thank you for being with us today. I'm Ryan Gilchrist. I'm a journalist and editor based in Yorktown, Virginia. Before we get started today, I do want to introduce my co-host. She's the executive in residence at Hampton University and a former newspaper editor and publisher, Marisa Porto. Marisa, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Tell us a little about the intention of these conversations before we get started.
Well, we've seen a lot of conversation about the here and now with the coronavirus, but we haven't seen a lot of conversation about the long-term effect of the coronavirus on different sorts of organizations. And in today's discussion, in particular about journalism across the nation and in Virginia. So that's why we're here today.
Okay, we have a couple of guests with us today. First is Martin Reynolds. He's the co-executive director of external affairs and funding for the Maynard Institute for Journalism Education. Martin, thank you for being here.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
We also have Jeff South. He's an associate professor of journalism at Virginia Commonwealth University. Jeff also directs the Capital News Service program, which allows undergraduate journalism students to cover state politics and government for distribution for news media around Virginia. Jeff, thanks for being here.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Marisa, we've got a couple of experts here. What do you want to know?
Well, I'd like to have both tell me a little bit about some scene setting discussion here. Maybe, Jeff, you can talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the journalism field in Virginia today.
Well, the pandemic has been, of course, incredibly disruptive to news media. A lot of my contacts, of course, are fairly recent graduates, almost all of whom have been furloughed at one point or another. You know, some of them have been called back now, but, you know, in terms of the lives of young journalists, this pandemic has really taken a hit. I know that some are looking at doing other things, going to graduate school, becoming, you know, shifting into public policy, doing some other career path because of this. So, so I think that on a personal level, the pandemic has been extremely, has been really impactful in a negative way. There are some positives. I think that certainly the public has grown in appreciation for local news in a way that it had not had before. So we've got, you know, this strange case, of course, where more and more people are interested in local news at this very time that the financial model has really, the floor has simply fallen out. And so we've got those things going on simultaneously.
Right, right. Martin, can you tell us a little bit about what's happening on the national stage? I know in your work in particular with media looking at diversity in the national stage, what do you see happening right now? Are you seeing similar trends?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is already exacerbated in a continuing trend. I mean, you've got, look at some of the major companies out there who are themselves, as Jeff alluded to, furloughing workers. Advertising revenue it was already cratering, has completely cratered for many. It's also impacting those in the nonprofit and independent space. So this space really grew in 2008, between 2008 and 2011, which has sort of been a bright spot, quite frankly, in the journalism space, more nonprofit news, more independent news. But that also has been problematic, as many of those models often rely on some corporate sponsorships. It also relies on memberships. Are people going to pay memberships when they're worried about paying their bills? So there's just a lot of uncertainty in the space across the industry right now. And then I think some folks have been saying, well, this could lead to the complete collapse of some large media organizations and chains. Some folks are heralding that as potentially a good thing for journalism. Others, I would say, disagree with that. I think there's probably pros and cons to that. I think having some of these large institutions have to change or go away maybe could be good in some cases as it brings about new models and new changes, but obviously there's a lot of communities that are still served by these publications, and these large institutions still represent a very important part of the journalistic landscape. And so I don't know that folks have the answers, but it's definitely something that is going to look differently as we look ahead.
Well, there's been some discussion now briefly about recovery and what that looks like. I guess from your perspective in the journalism field, Jeff, maybe you could tackle this one. Is there any recovery to what's going to happen in the journalism field?
I think that there's recovery, but I think the landscape will be completely changed.
Mm-hmm.
As Martin said, there's a lot of rethinking going on about what companies will look like, whether companies will survive. I think they'll survive, but I do think that print is probably dead. That, you know, that the days of having a paper thrown on your driveway in the morning might be gone forever, and maybe that's a good thing. That news will be delivered exclusively digitally.
Mm-hmm.
Or almost exclusively. I mean, maybe there'll be, you know, some limited print product that's, you know, available at the convenience store. But I think that we'll look at, you know, that the platform for distribution of news will shift. I think that there'll be a lot more attention on and enthusiasm for those smaller news organizations, often nonprofits, as Martin alluded to. In Virginia, there's an organization, Charlottesville Tomorrow, for example. In Charlottesville, that has been a partner with the mainstream newspaper, the Charlotte Daily Progress, but also operates on its own. And I think that there'll be a lot of young journalists are more interested maybe in working for that kind of organization than in working for a corporation that they feel maybe is more focused on the bottom line.
Martin, can you speak to the sort of entrepreneurial journalism aspect of what you see happening right now? I know we've had some conversations around a lot of journalists sort of taking to the Zoom,
Mm-hmm.
you know, using Zoom to get to their audience and finding different ways to get to their audience. Can you speak to that space a little bit?
Sure. Well, I think what's interesting is that, you know, how do you do reporting from when you're supposed to be sheltering in place? I think a lot of journalists are still sort of ignoring that, right? Putting on an N95 and getting out there in the community, because that's sort of what we have to do. I think the other part that I'm also finding really captivating, beyond just sort of how do journalists function in this, has more to do with how are you connecting to communities that you weren't a part of to begin with, and who you weren't connected with to begin with. Because what this virus and pandemic has really laid bare are these societal disparities that exist. And, you know, for our work around focusing on diversity, equity, inclusion in journalism, whether it's in newsrooms or in the portrayal of communities, it has really been incredibly, I mean, I was almost a little concerned, like, oh, now, well, like in 2008, will diversity be pushed off to the side, right? In service of, well, we just must survive.
Right.
But in fact, I think this is different in a way that I was unexpected and tragic in many ways, because of how this pandemic is affecting different communities across social fault lines of race, class, gender, differently. And it's laying bare the societal disparities that exist. And so I think as it relates to journalism and how that's evolving, what we're excited about is that there are many journalism entrepreneurs, some of whom we train as part of our Maynard 200 program, but who are sort of stepping outside these larger chains and traditional legacy institutions, which are important, but don't necessarily tap into sort of these niche communities and perspectives that are so needed right now. And so I think what I would like to see is more mainstream traditional news organizations actually tapping into the nonprofit space, the journalism entrepreneurs of diverse backgrounds, and figuring out how can these two entities, which both play important roles, work together to serve community, and perhaps maybe there's some new collaborations and partnerships that could emerge going forward.
Okay.
Martin, do you think that's the model? Obviously, with nonprofits and startups, there's a huge amount of risk involved. They're very difficult to keep going. Do you think that's the model to sort of wed them together with existing groups?
I think it could be. I mean, the problem is you have some power dynamics that could be at play there. But if you look at, for instance, ethnic media, so-called ethnic media, and the amount, the amount of money that the Gannett's of the world or the McClatchys think about as what they need to earn, right, is there's still lots of money in those space, even during, well, maybe it's a lot less now, but before this pandemic, there was still, dollar figures that would be dizzying to ethnic news organizations that are in communities that have always been undercapitalized. So what they often don't have is money, right? These ethnic and capacity, but often what the traditional legacy organizations don't have is trust and connection and relationships. So coming together, I think the benefit for the legacy organizations is it builds trust in communities where they're not trusted that often represent the audience of the future. For the ethnic organization, it represents a revenue share that they could, and some infusion that perhaps that they could have never have imagined. I don't know how it would work, but it certainly seems like something that could be, it would be an opportunity, a ray of hope at a time when there's a lot of despair.
Yeah.
That's a really exciting idea. I would love to see that kind of collaboration in the city where I live between the Richmond Free Press and the Richmond Times-Dispatch. It also kind of underscores, though, the perilous state of lots of organizations, but especially organizations that serve communities of color. And in Norfolk, it wasn't I believe the Journal and Guide has shut down, right? The Journal and Guide in Norfolk, it was a Black-owned newspaper.
Yes, that's right.
And so,
yeah.
So if we are going to have those partnerships, we need to mobilize quickly, whatever we're going to do to help save news organizations from completely falling off the radar.
So do you see some of that entrepreneurship or some of those ideas happening in the Commonwealth, Jeff?
No, not in I don't see them taking place, but I see the discussions taking place. I've seen a lot more news folk embracing the idea, for example, that government assistance might be part of the equation. And that's something that a lot of journalists, myself included, in years past have said, no way, we'll never have independent journalism covering government if journalists are taking money from government. Maybe there is a way of doing that, because I think that I think more of us now realize that that journalism is at such a crossroads here financially. Maybe we can figure out a way in which we can protect both the journalists' integrity, but also their financial sustainability by having some additional assistance from the government, and that might be ads, for example, that are related to the pandemic, and there's a campaign by the federal government or local governments to put ads in the Richmond Times-Dispatch and the Richmond Free Press and other news organizations. It could be putting up pathways for news organizations to tap into the stimulus package that Congress has approved for businesses at large. But news people being essential workers, I think that that something needs to be done. And I do see more of those kinds of discussions and kind of people turning to at least being open to the idea that that we can that we need some kind of solution, that government may be part of the solution for the financial viability of news organizations.
Mhm.
There seems to be discussion in that public TV space as well. There's I've heard of several initiatives, including the one at WHRO in Norfolk, where they're trying to build a sort of news team, not for breaking news as much, but specifically for, sort of more community analysis and that sort of thing. Martin, do you see that space opening up a little bit as well?
Well, I mean, to Jeff's point, we were asked to participate, sign our name to a letter calling for some stimulus, right? And we presented it to our board, and the board was really reticent to do that. And I think that there is probably some old school thinking, but I also think that, I like the idea. I think one way to do it, which would put some buffer in between, would be, as to Jeff's point, maybe it's ads. But I also think that this beckons a larger question, and that I think has to be turned back, particularly as it relates to mainstream news organizations, which have relied on advertising all of this time. It's sort of like, had you thought about this ahead of time and focused your attention more on community than on advertisers, then there would have been a level of protection, because you would have made considerably different decisions for how to approach community, how to approach your business model, if the people who you were serving were at the center of it from the beginning. So some of the work I've done around community engagement has really reshaped my thinking about that community needs to be shoulder and shoulder in thinking about the editorial focus of a particular publication, particularly local publications. I mean, I think the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journals, and the New York Times of the world are probably going to be fine, and they'll probably keep delivering papers as need be. But what about folks at the local level? And why have journalists still been resistant to thinking of community as a partner in framing coverage? It's almost like we had a convening last year where we brought together community activists and community organizers to talk to journalists about what they could learn about rebuilding trust. And it was during that conversation, and our friends at Free Press and Alicia Bell and Aaron, why am I forgetting his name? Aaron Craig, or Craig Aaron. Is it Craig Aaron or Aaron Craig? Can't remember the construction of the man's name at this point, because I've been locked inside for too many days. But Free Press did a great training about community mapping. And so I came away from that whole experience feeling like we keep talking about having engagement editors. I think we actually need organizing editors whose job it is to connect community to issues, connect journalists. And it doesn't mean we're abdicating, because we are activists. Journalists are activists. They don't want to say it, but we are. We're activists for news and information. We're activists to hold power to account. So why not behave in that way as it relates to building relationships and getting community to get behind your work, your movement, our movement, which is accurate news and information that can help people better serve their lives and their families and so forth. So I think we have to rethink our relationship. And had we done that and not worried about Macy's as much, and also, and last point I want to make on this is, there's certain things that can't be about unbridled profit. And I've come to the conclusion, I have a list, and my list is 7 things. It's healthcare, housing, education, prisons, music, art, culture, all under one, journalism, and transportation. So if we had a society where these 7 things were not about unbridled profit, it doesn't mean that healthcare can't be profitable. It doesn't mean that housing can't be profitable. It doesn't mean journalism can't be profitable. But there should be a different thinking about what role these critical pieces play in our society. And I just think, I have real concerns about for-profit journalism at this point. I just don't know that it serves society.
So toward that end, I'm going to ask you to look 3 years, 5 years down the road. We are in the middle of a transformational event in an industry, whether it's television version of this industry or whether it's the print version of this industry. We are in the middle of a transformational event at a time when the industry was already going through transformation. What does the industry look like in 3 or 5 years?
Jeff, you want to take that first in the comment?
Gosh.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think you'll have more news organizations and smaller news organizations. I think you'll see a lot more of the Charlottesville Tomorrow type news organizations that may just have 2 or 3 people and are focused not on being, you know, a mass medium, but have a specific focus. It might be the arts beat or the health beat or something like that, but you know, it's very, very niche oriented. So I think we'll see more of that. I think we'll see a bigger kind of a rise in more journalism that is solutions oriented, and has that engagement / advocacy approach that Martin just mentioned. There have been a number of webinars recently about the need to not just talk about the problems, but also what the solutions are, you know, as they relate to the pandemic, but also to other problems in society. And I think that we'll be seeing more attention on that. I see, as a kind of a data geek who teaches a lot of data journalism, data visualization kinds of skills to young journalists, I think we're going to see more of that. Martin mentioned the word mapping, and I think, you know, we'll see journalists who are relying more and more on data to shape the direction of their stories, or maybe to tell their stories. And so I think that we'll see, you know, the more and more journalists acquiring and leveraging their data skills. So I see those as some trends.
Mm-hmm.
Martin, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, a couple of those are excellent points, and I agree with all of that. I also agree that I think we're going to see, and we're going to try and support, are more outlets led by journalism entrepreneurs of color that are going to be focusing on specific niche issues, such as millennials, you know, African-American millennials around health, the folks from the Filipino community. So I think seeing more of that, so that there's a greater rise of these different perspectives. What I'd like to see is more collaboration between sort of mainstream and, general interest and niche, because I think my fear is that as more of these wonderful opportunities emerge and people sort of have these wealth of opportunities to sort of drill down into topics and issues, there's going to be less of a shared narrative. Not that there ever was a shared narrative, but my question is what are we going to do to bring us together as a society? I mean, if there's one thing that this pandemic has laid bare, is that, you know, how I behave does impact you. So if I walk outside, I don't have a mask on, you have a pre-existing condition, you know, my breath can impact you, even if I'm not symptomatic. So, and I think that this country has a real sickness around this notion of sort of self-determination, that I can just go build my castle, put a moat around it and a Tesla, and just do my thing. And so, number one, I don't think that's healthy from a societal perspective, and I don't think that's healthy from a journalistic perspective either. So what is going to be that through line that connects us? And I don't know the answer to that yet. I think we're still going to be trying to figure that out in the next 2 to 3 years. I think what has to happen is that these things have to bubble up and grow. And then from there, what is going to be the canopy that sort of is overarching over it all? And I don't know the answer to that. I also think that we're going to need to have philanthropy think about how it's spending its resources to support independent and nonprofit news. And I think there just has to be a greater emphasis on building relationships to community, and maybe the way in which journalists of all stripes and colors come together is that common narrative about what journalism does in service of society. Maybe there needs to be that national, got milk, where's the beef campaign for journalism that reaches across us all and connects us that way, and that we can identify and articulate our value to community. And so I also think there has to be an emphasis on organizing audience in respective communities to having journalism organizations center their approach, much like the new venture that's going to happen in Oakland. The Berkeley side folks are opening a newsroom in Oakland, and they have basically been taking complete organizing practices and having listening sessions to develop the beats that the community wants. Until we do that, why are people going to want to support us?
All right. Well,
Okay.
on that, I think that's a great way to end this conversation today. I want to take a moment to thank both of you for joining us and for sharing your journalism expertise with us today.
Oh, it was our pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you both for being here. Marisa, thank you as well. And for those of you watching, thanks for your attention. We appreciate it. There will be more conversations, so please stay tuned for more of these. For now, goodbye.